He is a cryptozoologist and a field researcher. He was also a co-host for the Missing in Alaska series. I know y'all have probably seen that. He's appeared on many radio and television shows. He's been featured in various articles across the globe. He has authored many books, I'm sure of which you can pick up in the back, and he is also a volunteer at the San Antonio Zoo. Please welcome Mr. Ken Gerhard.
Thank you, Ann. And thank you to all of you for showing up today. This is a fantastic event. Thanks to Russell, Michelle, Kenny, and everyone, all the fantastic folks that put this together. Can we have a round of applause for the organizers of this? I'll tell you guys, I go to a lot of these events around the country, and for a first year, this is amazing, and you guys are the ones that made it happen by showing up, so thank you. So my lecture today, oh, did we do a clicker? Oh. My lecture today is going to be an expanded and updated version of a lecture I gave last October at the Texas Bigfoot Conference in Jefferson. By show of hands, can I see how many people were there in Jefferson for the, okay, so for some of you this will be new, that's good. I'm going to be talking today about Littlefoot, which is not something that people have often heard about, but there are accounts and a body of evidence around the world that there could in fact be a second type, a pygmy-sized version of Bigfoot or Sasquatch, and that creature may in fact explain some of the legends around the world of quote-unquote little people that live out in the woods, and fairies, elves, whatever, you know, there are many, many names we can discuss. But in addition to talking about Littlefoot, I also wanted to speculate for a few minutes. And guys, you gotta admit, this is the perfect place to speculate about, you know, Bigfoot and all of the possible parameters of this phenomenon. So speculation is often fun. And I mean, I think you have to admit there really are no experts in the Bigfoot field, right? I mean, how can you be an expert on something that hasn't been proven? The evidence is elusive. We don't have a Bigfoot laying on this table that we can examine. So therefore, what we do as researchers in the Bigfoot field is we speculate based on the evidence that we have at hand and try to draw our conclusions from that. Now, some people are better, or I should say, more informed speculators than others. And that's not to downgrade or judge anybody that does this type of research, but there have been a handful of scientists that have gotten involved in the Bigfoot field through the years, very educated people that have really looked at a lot of the evidence, and their speculation is very interesting. So the nature of the speculation today is going to be with regard to the taxonomy of relict hominids, aka Bigfoot. How many people are familiar with the term taxonomy? Taxonomy is the classification of animal species based on their relationships, characteristics, and so forth. So basically what we're going to be talking about mainly, and I know we could have a whole lecture about what we think Bigfoot is or what it's derived from, if it's a flesh and blood thing, but I'm more interested in, like, are there different types of Bigfoot? Is that possible even? And you know, when I say, I'll be saying relict hominids a lot because you know, I mean that to be like a broad sweep of not only Bigfoot and Sasquatch here in North America, but the Yeti, abominable snowman, China's Yeren, Australian Yowie, Russian Almasty, the orang pendek. Many, many different types have been reported around the world with different physical descriptions. And I just have to reacquaint myself here with my, where's the computer name? Okay, so we have to acknowledge, of course, that there are differences in physical descriptions of relict hominids around the world. For example, you know, one example, you know, even here in North America, you know, you have the 7 to 8 foot tall Bigfoot or Sasquatch from British Columbia, Northern California. Then you have the Florida skunk ape, which many people have described as being only about 6.5 feet tall, 6 feet tall, more ape-like or thinner. Eastern Bigfoot, maybe a little bit more slender and gracile. And then you have the pygmy size, which we'll talk about. In Russia, many of the wild man accounts of Russia describe relict hominids that are hair covered, but then they are also wearing animal skins and using crude tools and things like that. So there's a lot of different variation in terms of description, and some of that may be cultural. But in the animal kingdom, and I've got some examples up here, there is a great deal of genetic diversity when you're dealing with wide-ranging terrestrial mammals. And so I pulled a few examples up here on the screen that we can look at. I love lasers, this is so fun. Okay, let's start up with this guy. Puma concolor. The puma, also known as the mountain lion, cougar, panther, painter, catamount, and so forth. These guys have the widest range in the Americas. They range all the way from southern Alaska to the southern tip of Chile and South America. Some scientists think that they're eradicated in the eastern United States, but I disagree with that. But these guys, there's a lot of difference, for example, between the Florida panther, small, 80 pounds, slender, and so forth, and a big mountain lion from Colorado that weighs 200 pounds. So, I mean, those are natural adaptations based on their environments, right? It's just you have genetic groups that are isolated from each other and they adapt to a certain environment. So that's one example. At one time, there were about 40 quote-unquote subspecies of mountain lions that different scientists argued about. They've kind of trimmed that down to a neat six different subspecies. Subspecies being defined as animals within a certain species that are distinct enough from each other, show enough distinct characteristics, whether they're physical or behavioral, where they are definitely considered different from the others. The American black bear, Ursus americanus, Latin name. And by the way, this is Kashka. This is one of our girls at the San Antonio Zoo. She's a sweetheart. Black bears range from pretty much all over North America down into parts of northern Mexico. And then if you go across to Asia, you'll find different types of black bears in parts of Asia as well. 16 different subspecies. And different color morphs, including the cinnamon-colored. You have the white Kermode bears of British Columbia, which are actually black bears, but they're white. Also known as spirit bears, the glacier bears of Alaska. So again, isolated groups that developed different characteristics. I'm sure there are a lot of hunters and outdoorsmen here that are looking forward to seeing this. And we'll laser point on the white-tailed deer, Otocoilus virginianus. And again, they range all over the Americas, North America, down into parts of South America. Lots of differences in different white-tailed deer. In fact, there's 40 different subspecies of white-tailed deer across the Americas. And finally, Vulpes vulpes, the red fox, probably the widest ranging animal in the northern hemisphere, all the way from North America to Central South America, I mean, pretty much everywhere. But there are 45 different species of red foxes around the world. So that's just one example. Okay, so now let's get to our speculators. And this is the father of my field of cryptozoology, Dr. Bernard Heuvelmans, an esteemed zoologist from the Royal Belgian Natural History Museum. In his 1955 groundbreaking book on the track of unknown animals, Heuvelmans writes about the Yeti, or abominable snowman of the Himalayas, and Heuvelmans is acknowledged as the first person to connect the Yeti with Gigantopithecus. That's the first time we ever heard about Gigantopithecus, and that, show of hands, Gigantopithecus, everyone cool with that? We're all Bigfoot people, right? Giant Pleistocene ape from Asia. And Heuvelmans speculated that maybe relict populations of Gigantopithecus made their way out of China and India and Vietnam into the Himalaya mountains to avoid contact with humans, and that's where they are to this day. Heuvelmans also writes about some little diminutive types, like the orang pendek of Sumatra, also known as the gugu, sadapa, orang kardil, and so forth. He writes about a type from Ceylon or Sri Lanka, known as the Nitevo. He writes about some from Africa, known as the Agagwe. And all of them are described as little hairy creatures. So he's definitely drawing a distinction between there's at least two types of relict hominids, a big muscular kind and a small, tiny kind. And then in 1969, Bernard Hogelmans, after viewing the remains of something known as the Minnesota Iceman, wrote a paper saying that there is now a third type. It's a surviving Neanderthal. That's what he felt. And he also, Boris Porchev, a Russian hominologist and esteemed scientist. So now we know Hogelmans endorsed at least 3 different types of relict hominids being a possibility. His colleague, Ivan Terence Sanderson, who is a Scottish-born zoologist, naturalist, author, botanist, and television personality, and author of the very influential book, Abominable Snowmen, Legend Come to Life, that influenced Roger Patterson and many of the people in this room, including myself. Sanderson suggested a classification system which included 4 distinct types of relict hominids based on his research. One was the classic Sasquatch of the Pacific Northwest, which he called the Neo-Giant. He drew a distinction between that and the Yeti, or Abominable Snowman, which he felt was more ape-like, and he called that a sub-hominid. That was the classification. He also described the wild man sightings of Asia and stuff as subhuman. And then the Proto-Pygmy, and he introduces the name Proto-Pygmy, which basically means a new type of hairy, or I guess a relic type of hairy little diminutive creature. So at the Texas Bigfoot Conference 2 years ago, Jeff Meldrum, we were asked about this during a panel, and Jeff Meldrum seemed to support Sanderson's classification of probably 4 different types of relict hominids. And my greatest hero in the Bigfoot field, Dr. Grover Krantz, physical anthropologist from Washington State University, and he was my hero because he was more pragmatic. And in fact, Krantz wrote, if you tell scientists that there's one type of undiscovered relict hominid, you're going to have a hard enough time convincing them. But then if you suggest that there are multiple types of undiscovered hominids running around, then you're going to lose all the credibility that you have. Science just is not open-minded enough to accept that possibility. So Krantz felt that, and of course he was a great proponent of the Patterson film, the authenticity of that. And by the way, thanks to M.K. Davis for this wonderful red filter of Patty that he gave me. That's awesome. You can see a lot of detail in there. So he equated, of course, Patty and other Sasquatches to Gigantopithecus. And, he even gave it a scientific name, Gigantopithecus blackeye, in the hope that someday the science would accept it based on, footprint evidence and so forth. Krantz did accept that, or acknowledge that it was possible, and he traveled to China and Russia and met with investigators in those 2 countries, that it was possible that there was a bipedal relict population of orangutans on mainland Asia and perhaps also in Sumatra that explained accounts of the Chinese yeren, which is always described as being reddish color, and the orang pendek or Sumatra. And Sanderson also just kind of quipped at the end that maybe it was possible that there were relict populations of Homo erectus, our ancestor, living in Australia, and that would explain accounts of the Yowie. So that's as far out as he would go. By the way, in case, and you need to know this if you're a Bigfoot researcher, does anyone know how many Bigfoots or Sasquatches Krantz suggested there would have to be in North America in order to sustain a breeding population? Has anyone heard that? He suggested about 2,000 individuals in the Pacific Northwest alone, Canada and all the contiguous states, and an additional 2,000 individuals in the eastern United States, maybe a few thousand. And there's a lot of science in that. Without a few thousand individuals breeding population, you would quickly lose the genetic diversity needed to have a viable population that would go through different generations. So. And then one of the leading cryptozoologists, Loren Coleman, in his 1999 book, The Field Guide to Bigfoot, Yeti, and Other Mystery Primates Worldwide, perhaps somewhat fancifully suggested that there are 9 different types of mystery hominids in the world, including all the classic ones that we know, but he also talked about marked hominids, true giants that stood 10 feet tall that were even bigger than Sasquatch, giant monkeys, and even mer beings, basically aquatic apes that would explain chupacabras. And so, you know, Lauren is obviously one of my heroes, super bright guy. I think he was heavily influenced by his good friend Mark A. Hall. Mark Hall's not a name a lot of you know, but he was a cryptozoologist that was very, like Lauren, he was a disciple of Ivan Sanderson. Pretty brilliant guy, very outside the box type of thinker, and wrote a series of journals where he suggested that there were many, many different types of mystery hominids in the world. But I think, you know, Lauren's goal, knowing Lauren here, his goal is basically just to push that barrier and to open as many minds as possible, to just consider these things, you know? I mean, just to think about them. They are worth considering. Okay, so now let's get on to Littlefoot. Let me take a swig here. So, most of you are aware of the discovery in 2003. A team of archaeologists working on a tiny Indonesian isle called Flores at a place called Liang Bua Cave discovered the fossils of a number of individuals of something that has now become known as Homo Floresiensis, or the Hobbit. These guys were only about 3 feet tall. They lived, the original estimate was that they were living up to about 18 to 12,000 years ago, which is pretty amazing if you thought about that. There was another human species around 12 to 18,000 years ago. But just recently that's been adjusted with more advanced carbon dating back to 50,000 years. Still pretty remarkable, guys. We're talking about a hominid that displayed a mosaic of both primitive and derived characteristics running around with humans 50,000 years ago. So very close to modern times. Now, there's been a lot of controversy surrounding Homo floresiensis, but in the past 14 years, a number of extensive studies have been done on the skull, the brain, you know, endocast, the wrist bones, and it is now believed, originally it was suggested by some science skeptics that, these are just humans. They're like dwarf humans that have microcephaly or, you know, smaller brains or whatever. But there are enough physical characteristics now that have been studied where paleoanthropologists can say, no, these were not human. These were something else. Coincidentally, and you know, a lot of their characteristics have been compared to Homo habilis, which was a little small hominid that lived in Africa about 2 million years ago and possibly one of our earliest ancestors. There's also another theory that these are actually dwarf versions of Homo erectus, which came later, and that because they were isolated on this island, they had to become very small, which is a sound theory as well. But also very recently, an anthropologist in Canada's Simon Fraser University named Mark Collard did a study, and they found that the most likely scenario is that not Homo erectus, as previously thought, but little tiny diminutive hominids like Homo habilis were the first ones to radiate out of Africa about 2 million years ago and spread around the world. So let's absorb that for a minute. The theory now is that about 2 million years ago, little tiny 3 to 4 foot tall pre-human ancestors spread out of Africa all over the world, and possibly as far as in Indonesia. There's no evidence of relict hominids in the Americas, of course. This is all Asia, Africa, and so forth. So that's kind of interesting. And, you know, backtracking for a second, just before I forget, you know, what Grover Krantz was saying about how science could not readily accept the reality of several different types of relict hominids, how there just wasn't enough evidence to support that. There's an opposite theory which states that, and recently was stated by a leading anthropologist from the Smithsonian, that the normal game plan, if you will, for hominids for the past few million years has been multiple species all living together at one time. So that's been the normal pattern. So why, to quote Jeff Meldrum, why would now be the exception? Why would we still not have multiple types of hominids living on the same planet? So, all right, so we've established that there are, as recently as 50,000 years ago, 3 foot tall, presumably hair-covered non-human creatures running around. And one of the legends on the island of Flores talk about the Ibu Gogo. So they have a legend on that island, the natives do, about little hairy men that they eradicated, perhaps centuries ago. So what are the commonalities? And I'm going to show you in a second a list of proto-pygmies around the world. The commonalities in most of the quote-unquote little people legends all over the world are about the same size, about 3.5 to 4.5 feet tall, covered in hair, that's pretty common. Ancient faces is one description that I've read, but very, muscular and broad. Behaviorally, they're often, this is interesting, they're often endowed with magical qualities, right? Little people, they can vanish into thin air, they can put a spell on you, they can convince you. So that's I don't know where to go with that, but that has to be mentioned. And the other thing is that they supposedly always live in caves or under the ground. So those motifs can be found in a lot of different mythologies around the world. Now here's a list on the left of some of, not all of, the little people legends around the world. And this is another picture on the right. This is Homo habilis. So that's what Homo habilis would like. So let's go to the list. For example, here in the south of the United States, we have something known as the Little Red Men of the Delta in Mississippi. MK, have you ever heard of the Little Red Men of the Delta? That's kind of a little, pygmy-sized. They said these aren't, I keep kind of jumping around here, but I know what some of you are thinking. These proto-pygmies, these are juvenile Sasquatches. That's what people are seeing. Could be in some cases. The problem with that is that people often report these proto-pygmies in pairs, in groups, and there's no adult around. And you would presume that a 3-foot Sasquatch is probably pretty young, right? Probably just a baby. So yeah, we have a lot of different names here around the world. So it's a widespread thing. It's all over the world, this notion of little hairy man-like creatures. Now my first inquiry into the proto-pygmy phenomena took place in 2004. I mounted an expedition to the nation of Belize in Central America, formerly British Honduras. I had read in Ivan Sanderson's book that there were reports of something known as the Duende. Duende is Spanish for goblin. And that while many Belizeans felt like the Duende was more of kind of like an elf, a mischievous, imp-like creature, that Sanderson had interviewed junior forestry officers that told him that, no, we've seen the Duendes, they are man-like, they are covered in hair, they live at the edge of the forest. So that was my desire in 2004 to travel to Belize and investigate legends of these little proto-pygmies, and I went to an area called the Maya Mountains. If any of you have ever been to Belize, you've more than likely been on the coast where it's gorgeous Caribbean oceans and keys and blue holes. But as you get into the interior of Belize, which is just south of Mexico, it's one of the least inhabited nations in the world. There's almost no one living in the interior in these lush jungle areas. Very, very low population density. So here I am in the Maya Mountains looking at a flattened area in 2004. From a book on Belizean folklore, here's a typical interpretation of the Duende, which is rather fanciful. They're said to be like little old men with a long beard, wearing a hat, carrying a machete, backwards pointing feet, it's hard to see here, and that they only have 4 fingers. But again, Sanderson heard from other people in the area that the Duende was actually a real thing and that was covered in hair and didn't look like this at all. By the way, while I was in Belize, I was also investigating something known as the Sisamito, which is, Belize has 2 different types of reports. And am I blocking the screen from you guys? I'm sorry. Okay, that's good. This is a very well-planned event. We'll just point that out again. The Sisamito the descriptions are very similar to the Sasquatch. Standing about 6.5 to 7 feet tall, kind of gorilla-like, but walking on its hind legs. But again, only 4 fingers. That's a recurring theme in Belizean culture if you ask anyone about the Sisamito or the Duende. So while I was down in Belize, I did speak to a number of people. I heard some, again, rather whimsical accounts of Duendes kidnapping children. And again, that's another little people thing, is that they abduct, I'm not trying to scare if there are any kids in the audience. They're said to abduct small children. That's one of the things that the little people do. Maybe that's more about the parents telling the little kids, don't go out there and play right now because the Duendes are going to grab you. And abduct you. But there was a Duende sighting from no less than Alan Rabinowitz in the 1980s. One of the leading zoologists in the world, Alan Rabinowitz, was setting up the Coxcomb Jaguar Sanctuary in Belize and claims that he saw a fleeting glimpse of a small man-like figure standing in the woods. So I didn't find a lot of evidence while I was there. We did find some footprints in a remote area that were somewhat human-shaped with a very pointy heel. And that is yet another detail that I keep forgetting to mention, that often the tracks of little Proto-Pygmies are said to have pointy heels. And maybe that applies to some of the folklore of little people as well. So in 2000, I forget now, it's probably 2011 or something, I was up doing a presentation in northern Minnesota at a Native American casino, big event, lots of people there. And after my speech, I was approached by an Ojibwe Chippewa family who lived on a reservation in North Dakota, and they, very firmly told me that their reservation was being overrun by savage hairy dwarfs known as the Menejwesi, and that these little hairy dwarfs were stealing their dogs, breaking into their sheds, stealing their food, and these people were scared. And this is a pretty freaky story. How many people are more scared of little things than big things here? There's a psychology behind something that's little creeping around, right? As opposed to the big Sasquatch lumbering through the woods. It's like, oh, these little things are coming in and taking our food and our dogs. So this is from North Dakota, where the Dakotas, where a lot of these North American legends of little people emanate. And nearby in Montana, there's a place called the Little Pryor Mountains in Montana, where there's a very famous legend of the Owakule or Nurumbi, which are said to be little savage hairy dwarfs with pot bellies, short limbs, but very powerful, and that they actually shot poison arrows at people as they walked by. And there are some painted pictographs on the rocks there in the Pryor Mountains that are attributed to these. So I could literally go on and on recounting tales of hairy little people around the Americas. And I guess we're focusing on the Americas now. When I was up in Alaska in 2015 filming Missing in Alaska, we did an episode on the quote-unquote gnomes, which unfortunately you have to collaborate with TV producers sometimes, and they were really insistent we had to be gnomes. But in Alaska, there is a great fear of the little people. People talk about Sasquatch, the hairy man, and they're scared of that. But man, if you mention the little people, it's... And they have a number of native names. There are Yupik legends, there are Inuit legends that describe and the names are very hard to pronounce. Anukins, Muskalatox, Urshanok, Ingstiak, Jinxihak. But they are always described as little hairy men that live in caves and that abduct children. And that sometimes have magical powers and are somewhat mischievous. So we did an episode on that, and we actually spoke to a woman that claimed to have had some activity. But before we get there, this is something from the Pacific Northwest and specifically British Columbia known as the Bookwass. Have you guys heard that name, Bookwass? Well, there's a misconception in the Bigfoot field that Bookwass means Bigfoot. But actually, according to Thomas Seward, who is a Kwakiutl native from Vancouver Island, the Bookwass is a little man. He's a little tiny guy that's only about 3 feet tall, and that they're seen only at night when they come out onto the beach and scrape up oysters and clams and different shellfish. And Seward claims that he saw a Bookwass years ago. Here he is doing a tribal dance with a Bookwass costume, and this is an older tribal Bookwass costume. And then this is Sarah. She's the lady that we interviewed up in Alaska who claimed that her property, and she lives out in kind of a really remote part of western Alaska, kind of out there near Nome, claims that, and that's a coincidence, right? Sightings of the little people are near Nome, that she had seen these things on her property and that her sons had also seen these things running around her property. And they were all extremely terrified of these things, so. Boy, I'm moving around a lot faster than I thought I would here, so. Okay, and so most recently, I interviewed a gentleman. One of the benefits, of course, to being on television is that sometimes people will get in contact with you and try to tell you about their experiences. And admittedly, if you'd like a little insight into that process, you always have to be a very objective and skeptical researcher when you talk about these things. So sometimes people contact me, and I'm always very gracious and open-minded, and I'm interested in hearing what they have to say. But if what they have to say is just so far out there that I can't even really wrap my head around it, then at that point I have to, maybe tell them I'm going to put it in my file and, just kind of push it to the side for now. Case in point, we were talking a few minutes ago about the population of potential Sasquatches in the Americas, right? A few thousand maybe is what Krantz proposed. Most people have agreed with that. If they exist, there has to be a few thousand. Lauren Coleman thinks it's less, maybe only about 1,500. So when people contact me and tell me they have a colony of 12 to 15 Sasquatches on their property, that's hard for me to accept, as an objective. And again, not to poo-poo things, but I mean, guys, think about it. If there's 2,000 or even 1,500 Sasquatches in all the Americas, why do you have 15 on your property, which is, I don't know, however many acres, but... So anything is possible, and I always try to stay as open-minded as I can. But, and of course, the other dangerous thing in terms of research is, as we said, there are no experts. I certainly don't label myself as an expert, although sometimes when you're on a TV show, they might pop that up, or if you're doing an interview, they might label you as a Bigfoot, quote-unquote, expert. Lyle was talking about this last night. However, when I'm contacted by other researchers who tell me that they've got it all figured out, they know what they are, I'm a little skeptical, and I always want to hear what they have to say, but it's just a very dangerous position to me to just, work under that assumption that you have all this knowledge about an unknown. But I was contacted by a couple back in 2016, September of 2016, a gentleman from Ohio named Jake Dressel and his wife called me, or first they emailed me and then we set up a phone call to tell me that they had seen on their property, and keep in mind there's two types of people that contact me. There are people that have had a lifelong interest in this and have had experiences and know where to go, and there's also people that have never had any interest in Bigfoot or anything weird, and then they've had an experience and they need to tell somebody or talk to somebody about it, and so, they get in touch with someone like myself or Cliff or Lyle or whatever. So this couple, and I interviewed them both at the phone extensively one night, swear to me that on 2 different occasions they were out walking their dog, right before the sun came up. They're early risers, maybe 4 or 5 in the morning, and first time the husband was outside, Jake, and he heard this dog barking, and he looked up just in time to see a little, what he described as a 3-foot tall, hairy creature walking on 2 legs, waddling by on his property and then into the trees. And his dog was just freaking out and acting up. Well, he didn't know exactly what he had seen, and he honestly didn't want to tell his wife about it because he just thought, oh, that's just weird. Maybe I'm still dreaming, maybe I'm still asleep. But then lo and behold, his wife was out jogging the very next morning, I guess also with the dog, and the dog started acting up again, and she saw it. And this is Jake's sketch of what they agreed that they saw, which they described as a little troll-type creature walking, hobbling on 2 legs. Now, this is Ohio and somewhat of a wooded area from what I can tell, but maybe not the most remote area, so maybe it's harder to wrap our head around that, or is it? Is it harder for a Sasquatch to hide, being 7 feet tall and 300 to 500 pounds, or something that's only this big, So, that is, the basic gist of the little people. The most famous Proto-Pygmy is the Orang Pendek of Sumatra, who I'm sure many of you have heard of. And Orang Pendek, it actually means little man. I, unfortunately, have not had the opportunity to travel to Sumatra and investigate the Orang Pendek, which has become very famous in the annals of cryptozoology at this point. But Adam Davis has been down there several times, of course, and also a colleague of mine from England named Richard Freeman has mounted some expeditions there, both with and without Adam. And they have interviewed many people in that area and are both convinced that the Orang Pendek is not a human-like creature, but more of a bipedal ape. And interestingly enough, they think that it might be very similar to the upright orangutan that Grover Krantz suggested. That's what they think the orang pendek is. So we have to summarize now, and we're going to say we have to acknowledge that at least some of the little man reports around the world may have been spawned by accounts or encounters with perhaps monkeys. You know, think about centuries ago when European explorers first went to Africa, Asia, and ran across monkeys and small apes. They may have perceived them as looking very human-like and thought, you know, come back to, we saw these little hairy men that were running around, and, you know, so that certainly may be the origin for some of the little man proto-pygmy legends around the world. Similarly, there are races of little people around the world, aren't there? There are the actual Pygmies of Africa, the Baka people, you know, who are very small and live in an environment, by the way, where it's very conducive for them to be small. So maybe, again, encounters with these pygmy people, and I'm sorry for using that word, I guess it's considered kind of a derogatory, I should just say the Baka people of Africa. Encounters with these Baka people, again, they came back home and said, we saw these groups of little people that were only that tall, you know. So that certainly could account for some of the Proto-Pygmy legends. But when we consider that the Proto-Pygmies are essentially described almost all over the world, and I don't have time to lay that out here, but there are accounts of little hairy man-like creatures all over the world, or at least accounts of quote-unquote little people that live in the woods or in the wilderness all over the world. And when we also consider that discoveries in the field of paleoanthropology are leading to things like Homo Floresiensis and the Dmanisi hominids, which were discovered in the Asian nation of Georgia in recent years, little teeny man-like creatures that lived perhaps as recently as tens of thousands of years ago, then to me at least it becomes pretty compelling that, you know, the possibility exists that there are at least two types of hominids. So let's circle back around to our taxonomy or classification system, using Sanderson's classification system as a model. I think we're all in agreement that there is at least one type of mystery hominid that stands about 6.5 to 7 to 8 feet tall, that's very muscular with broad shoulders, no neck, covered in hair, and that would account for the majority of sightings of Bigfoot, Sasquatch, the skunk ape, the yeti, and other similar creatures, the Chinese yeren, around the world. Now, I would take that a step further and say that based on the evidence that I've looked at in all of these accounts, that there might be a second type of mystery hominid, perhaps something closer to our ancestors, that is accounting for tales of hairy little people or proto-pygmies around the world. From a scientific standpoint, it's hard to swallow. Probably any scientist would get up and walk out of the room right now, but maybe not. And then you have the third and fourth types, which are a little bit more ambiguous in terms of the sightings of more human-like relict hominids that are using crude tools and stuff. Perhaps those could be relict populations of Homo erectus, but that might be a stretch. And also, when people talk about the more ape-like types of relict hominids, you know, I think a lot of that to me could be an issue of interpretation. While one person might encounter a Sasquatch and say, man, it looked like a giant gorilla walking on its hind legs, the person next to him might say, man, it had a really human-like face. It looked like a hair-covered human that was very ape-like. So it's kind of, unfortunately, a lot of gray area there to work with. So, yeah, I actually thought I was going to run out of time a lot faster. I guess, have we done any questions today at all? I could open up the floor for about 5 or 10 minutes of questions if you guys are interested in doing that. And not to be unkind, but folks, please questions and not so much statements. I'd love, if you have a statement or a story that you'd like to tell me, I'd love to hear it, come to my table. But in this situation or format, sometimes statements tend to make us run over a little bit. Yes, ma'am, I'm sorry, was it a statement? Did I shoot you down? Okay, go ahead. It's all speculation, exactly.
So along those same lines that you
Mm-hmm.
would you say that nationwide, much less around the world like Australia, because of the
Mm-hmm.
outage? So would you speculate that nationwide, including Canada, that there's more than 300 to 500 out there?
300 to 500 individuals? Not tied. Oh, yes. I would absolutely agree that in order to have a viable breeding population of any type of animal species, it's been proven that the very minimum number is about 1,000 individuals. And they have to be in fairly close contact too, because if you have 1,000 individuals spread out too far, they might not connect when they need to.
Well, the reason I ask that is not only Dr. Sheffield split down and Dr. Mel Ketchum, he has said very clearly that he doesn't think more than at the very most 500 exist in the world. And so my way of thinking of that is that, because that is way common sense that there would be
More than 500. Okay, so if you guys didn't hear that, she has an issue with Dr. Jeff Meldrum proposing only 500 individuals at the most. And we have to revisit the fact that Meldrum, of course, was essentially a protege of Grover Krantz, but they disagreed on a number of topics. I'm certainly not putting myself in a position to stand head to head with Meldrum in terms of, he's a PhD, but I do work at a zoo. I work with animals a lot, and sadly a lot of endangered animals. And 1,000 individuals is where there's starts to become trouble. So it is hard for me to believe personally that there would be less than 1,000. And also if you have to count for all of the sightings around.
Well, but Ketchum is more like
Mm-hmm.
Have you had a ball yet? Have a ball. I'm having a ball.
Well, we're not here to necessarily, everyone's going to have a different opinion. I appreciate your comments. There are a lot of very passionate people in the Bigfoot field with very strong opinions and different levels of experience. And I always like to point out to people, if any of you think there's a little bit too much drama in the Bigfoot field, because I hear that all the time, guys, it's always been this way. If you go back to the original Tom Slick expeditions in the 1950s, they all hated each other. John Green, Peter Byrne, Grover Krantz, Renee hated Grover Krantz. John Green won't even acknowledge Peter Byrne. I mean, these are all guys that made very serious contributions to Bigfoot research. Spent decades, most of their lives, in the field, but they were very strong personalities. And because they're very passionate, and I don't know why, I'm not a psychologist, but it's ego. Yeah, that's true. There's a lot of this too. Yes, ma'am. The little people will get you if you go out in the woods or whatever. Yeah, that's true. The young are more vulnerable, that's for sure. So that's a fair point, that is probably a natural instinct that we have. Hmm? No, the Yeti is not white. If any of you take anything one home, I know at least two colleagues, Lauren Coleman and Richard Freeman, that will freak out if they see a white Yeti. The Yeti is not white. That's just an assumption based on the fact that footprints are found in the snow. But guess what? They don't live in the snow. They can't. They live in the temperate valleys, and their footprints are seen as they're crossing around. So all sightings of the Yeti are brown, black, and so forth. We do have white Sasquatches. And that's a nice segue into my new book. If you guys are interested, I do talk about white Sasquatches in Tennessee in my new book, among other things. So, well, guys, I'm going to wrap it up. Thank you so much for coming out here. Hang tight. We have two excellent speakers left. Stacy Brown and Lyle Blackburn coming up.
Mr. Ken Gerhard, ladies and gentlemen. All right, we're gonna give out some more door prizes. This lady right here, hey, grab you some. Oh! 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Wow, there's people over there. 6, 7. Oh my God. Do we have that many? She said if you got a ball, come to her. She's tired. For y'all, if you don't know, this is Michelle Miller of Southeast Texas Bigfoot. This is her shindig. And we actually sold 1,000 tickets today, y'all, so it was pretty good.